Throughout all of history, the world has been engaged in conflict. Our past is full of bloodshed and fighting. The great historian Machiavelli wrote this: "A prince should have no care or thought but for war." However, times have changed, and one of mankind's greatest accomplishments is not one of death and destruction, but of diplomacy. For with today's weapons, war could destroy us all. This is Defcon 2, Our Lives in Their Hands. In 1949, the USSR acquired nuclear technology, ushering in the Cold War, an undeclared contest between capitalism and communism. The two nations of America and the Soviet Union clashed at every possible intersection, starting crises like the Berlin airlift in 1948, the Korean War, the space race in 1957, and the Berlin Wall in 1961. But the scariest event was yet to come.
He thought the missiles were not fully operational, but they were.
That something bad really could have happened.
I was waiting for the bombs to strike.
It started as a plan. The Soviets had nowhere else to turn, and it seemed their entire nation would be destroyed by the Americans. But there was one way out. Cuba was right under their nose, and if the Soviets could take advantage of Cuba, they might have a chance in the Cold War.
He basically says that the United States had ringed the Soviet Union with nuclear bases, including bases, say, in Turkey, that were right on the Soviet border, and that he wanted to make the United States feel as insecure and as threatened as the Soviets felt. And therefore, he felt that by placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, he would equalize that situation.
So the Soviets sent ships to buy the excess cargo that the Americans had boycotted just weeks before, and slowly but surely, Cuba became a communist nation, the first in North America. At the time, Cuba was controlled by a dictator named Fidel Castro. Castro was born in Cuba in 1926. He was well educated with a law degree from the University of Havana. Castro grew up in Cuba under the oppressive communist Batista regime. Batista was greedy and very unpopular, and in 1953 Castro led a group of Cuban rebels in an attempt to overthrow the communist government. Castro effectively used guerrilla warfare, and on January 1st, 1959, Batista fled the country and Castro took over. Now, the United States supported Castro in his rebellion, but when he went communist, the United States saw it as a betrayal.
That a lot of Americans felt prior to 1959 that the Cubans looked up to us, the Cubans respected us, the Cubans were grateful because we gave them their independence, although we didn't really in 1898. So it was considered a terrible betrayal when Cuba went communist.
Without the aid from the United States, Castro looked to the Soviets for help. Castro nationalized U.S. industries on the island, and trade stopped between the two countries. On January 3, 1961, all diplomatic ties between Cuba and the United States were broken. So that brings us to the two reasons why Castro decided to accept the missiles from the USSR. The first reason is simple. Castro has a responsibility to protect his people, his country, and his government. Not soon before he accepted the missiles, the United States sent Cuban rebels to attack Cuba in the Bay of Pigs on April 17, 1961. Castro was simply protecting his country from a possible second invasion.
I think mostly he was just afraid of another Bay of Pigs invasion. I think he felt that Kennedy had been humiliated at the Bay of Pigs, that he was going to try everything he could to overthrow Castro, and that a way of dissuading Washington from doing that would be to accept this Soviet offer of missiles. And I think Castro wanted to show other nations in the hemisphere that there's another path to modernization, there's another path to national greatness that does not necessarily have to be sponsored by Washington. And so he wanted to set himself up as an exemplar of a new kind of Latin American nation that didn't depend for its defense or self-respect and economic wherewithal on the United States.
the United States, proud, a superpower of the world. Its people were united and confident in their government, and they had a huge advantage in the Cold War. They had far more warheads than the Soviets, and they were placed all over Europe. It was a strong time for America, until Kennedy learned of the missiles. He was told that they had 7 days before they became operational, and everyone who knew about it was terrified. They told him an immediate strike was necessary, but Kennedy kept a clear head.
As a consequence of the Bay of Pigs, he is much less willing to abdicate authority or just to rely upon the judgment of people who may have really impressive pedigrees, but who, when push comes to shove, turn out to be wrong. So I think that's what gave rise to that possibly apocryphal story at the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy went around the room in the executive committee and said, "How many of you guys think we should launch a preemptive strike?" And every person in the room said yes, and Kennedy allegedly said, "All right," and I say no, and I guess the no's have it.
The missiles were in Cuba, a country not only very near to the United States, but also a country demonized in recent years for being communist.
Indeed, every man, woman, and child in Cuba had been trained for war. Over 6 million people. Their enemy is America, you and me, and the Cuban children who know Americans only through Castro's lies are growing up. When they do, World War III may be fought in New Orleans and New York, not Normandy and Naples.
Kennedy knew that the American people would be terrified to hear that there were nuclear missiles in Cuba, so he kept the information from them for as long as he could. This may have been a good thing. After all, ignorance is bliss, but some people feel that he should have told the public.
I don't see what ill could have resulted from him basically stating the facts, rather than waiting to come forward with the situation when he finally made that famous televised address.
Well, whether it was their right to know or not, or whether Kennedy had a responsibility to tell them, is up to you. But eventually he did announce the situation, and the majority of Americans were terrified, to say the least.
Your Uncle Bob was a baby, 6 months old. And I got all dressed up. I did my nails, I did my hair, I got all dressed up. I dressed the baby up. And when your grandfather came home, he didn't know what was happening. I was waiting for the bombs to strike. And he got scared. But thank goodness they didn't strike.
It sounded with alarm. The Russian ships were sailing all across the sea. We all feared by daybreak it will be World War #3.
There was lots of fear, but Kennedy still had to deal with the missiles in Cuba, and he had a plan to get them out. He assembled a committee of his highest executives, or XCOM, that conversed about the issue. XCOM eventually helped Kennedy to decide that a naval blockade would be the best course of action, and because blockades were not allowed by the United Nations, Kennedy called it a quarantine, and any ships wishing to travel to or from Cuba would have to be checked. On October 24th, the quarantine was implemented, and on the same day, nuclear defense condition was set to Defcon 2, the highest mark before nuclear war. On October 25th, the next day, Soviet ships in the Atlantic turned around. Dean Rask commented on the turnaround, saying, "We were eyeball to eyeball, and I think the other fella just blinked." In the end, the deal was that the Soviets would remove the missiles and that the United States would not attack Cuba and remove their missiles stationed in Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis has helped to shape the political world of today. Since the crisis, leaders from all over the world have realized the benefits of diplomacy and the devastating nature of all wars, nuclear and non-nuclear.
Stand up next to you and defend her still today, 'cause there ain't no doubt I love this land. God bless the U.S.